Hello and welcome to DevSecon Germany, another edition of our monthly meetup session, a virtual meetup session. And DevSecon Germany is a chapter of the global DevSecon community, an inclusive community that educates and enables developers in application security. And today I'll be joined by Maximilian Stauß from Aramido, talking about application threat modeling explained in a playful way with a card game. And before we get started, I want to say a few things about the logistics. So first of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Matthias. I'm the host of the DevSecon Germany chapter, and also beside that, a co-founder of a security startup called Quasar. And you as the listener, you can join us on YouTube, on the YouTube stream. It's also be recorded, and also join us in our Discord channel. So if you go to to devsecon.com, you can join our Discord channel there, and then we have the DevSecon Germany channel where you can ask questions and discuss the topic during the session. Also, we record the session, so it will be available later on. Feel free to share the link, and also feel free to ask questions afterwards, even after the session. So DevSecon itself is brought to you by Sneak, but the aim is to create a vendor-neutral space and to share knowledge and best practices related to software security. That's it for the introduction, and I would like to introduce now our speaker, Maximilian Stauß. Hello, Maximilian.
Hi, Matthias. Thanks for having me. Welcome. Yeah, my name is Maximilian. You can call me Maxi or Max. Any form of Maximilian is fine. I'm a information security consultant at Aramido, based in Karlsruhe, Germany. We do all kinds of security consulting, secure coding training, awareness training, penetration tests for infrastructure and applications, ISO certifications, basically everything that's security related. And yeah, one part of our job is also doing threat modeling and doing workshops with developers. And that's basically where the idea came from. And I'm very happy to share our thoughts and how we do it. And I'm looking forward to also input from your side, any questions that you might have. Yeah, I think one of my colleagues might join us later when we want to play a game together. So he might get the link, and yeah, his name is Armin. You can maybe then accept him as a speaker.
Great. So just another comment. So for the audience, feel free to just drop in your questions, and I will pick them up. I will then moderate it and ask you when it makes sense to interrupt you, right? So just for the information, drop the questions in on YouTube or in the Discord channel. And I now hand over to you. And we have Armin also already here. So I hand over to you and let me know if I should to the stream or not.
Okay, then let's go. So the topic is what could possibly go wrong? Threat modeling with a card-based approach. So in the beginning, I'd like to talk a little bit. Yeah, I already said that. I want to talk a bit about the motivation, why we actually developed threat modeling workshops, why threat modeling in general is important, I would say, for all developers. Give a little bit of background about gamification and other serious games in the context. We are not the first ones to develop a card game for threat modeling. Then I want to share with you how our card game works, how it looks, how it plays, and then we're going to show a few cards and play like a demo version, how we would do it with clients, how we do it at workshops. I think we can all agree that security must be thought about and considered at the very early stages when developing applications. So the cost of fixing bugs and fixing vulnerabilities at a later stage is much higher. So there is this concept called shift left, where when you think about the development process, you move the security aspects to the early stages, to the beginning, to the left side of the process. And application threat modeling is one of the ways to think about security. And Also, the OWASP top 10 most relevant information security problems for web applications has been updated last year. And insecure design is one of the new categories. And that means that even no matter how good you code some things, some ideas are just insecure by default. So one example would be that's also the example that OWASP gives, I think, security questions to authenticate users or to authenticate people is an insecure design decision that no matter how well you implement the security questions or the process to answer the questions, there is a design flaw, meaning that security questions are not secrets. For example, name of your first pet or mother's maiden name. Anyone can find that information online, for example, and therefore it's insecure and should not be used as an authentication method. And if you realize that later on in the development process or when the application is already being deployed and being used, changing that is very difficult later on. So you have to think about it in the beginning when designing your applications. And since this updated OWASP top 10 list was published, I think the relevance of application threat modeling is also even more present now. And in this modern agile way of developing applications, you could also see that the software development process is not finished in the end. So it's not a linear process that is being done only once, but it's like a circle of life cycle. And application threat modeling should be done, if you can, in the planning phase. So at the earliest stage, when you have an idea, when you think about the application and the features that it should have, you should also think about security. Let me just check the comments. I think we already have some questions.
Yeah, we got one question here. Could PKI be considered secure in that case? I think it's very specific to your example you gave.
PKI, private key infrastructure?
Yes, I think very specific to your example, right?
Yeah, that's very specific. I think key infrastructure or cryptographic keys would, of course, also be a valid authentication method. Like if you think about FIDO, that's like passwordless authentication using cryptography. That's, of course, more secure than having public knowledge that anyone could find. Absolutely. So the threat modeling, well, I already said it, it's not a new idea. It has been around for some time, but it's getting traction and we have more and more questions about it. And so we wanted to share what are the basic aspects of application threat modeling, what should be done, how is it done in the industry. And so the first step is always to understand the application and the use case. So you have to know what you actually want to program, what the features are, what the functions are, and also think about what values are in the application. So we're going to go into more detail about that, but thinking about what types of data will you process, personal data, financial data, credentials, and define what your security objects and goals are. So you have to know what you want to protect and how you want to protect it. You want to understand the risks and threats that exist against your application. That could be external hacker attacks, for example, but it could also be misuse of the application by the users or any errors, human errors, for example, are of course also threats and risks that you have to remediate at the planning stage, ideally. And when you do a threat modeling workshop, the result of the threat model should also be countermeasures. So you have to know what to do in your application, how to program more securely, what features to implement or what not to implement, and that should be as concrete as possible. So the result of such a threat modeling workshop would be more knowledge about the application on the one side, knowledge about threats and risks, and also how to counteract, basically all the countermeasures that you could take. One very prominent approach to understanding applications is data flow diagrams, or DFDs. There is one example how it could look on the screen right now. In my experience, I have not yet seen a company that actually does data flow diagrams, like in a very good way. Most of the clients that I have seen, most of the workshops were based on more high-level documentation. So if you think about in what stage the application is, or what stage of the planning the developers are, most of the time it's more like infrastructure diagrams. Data flow diagrams are very specific, very concrete, and it would take a lot of time to actually design the application in that very detailed level. So you will probably not see them in the real world, or at least I have not. But it is very important to have some kind of documentation. That is because everyone should have the same knowledge, and especially in the early stages when you have an idea of an application, you should write down everything that you have planned. You should know how to build the application, and in any case, if you do threat modeling, any type of information, any type of documentation is better than no diagram at all. But you shouldn't wait to do application threat modeling until your DFDs are finished. When we think about protection objects and protection goals, we basically do a very basic CIA prioritization. So the main goals of information security, availability, confidentiality, and integrity should be thought about, and that can also be used to later prioritize your countermeasures or prioritize the risks. So some applications like an online shop might have very high requirements with regards to availability. So if your business depends on the application being very performant and available, you will probably have very high priority targets in that regard. So denial of service attacks would be very bad for you. If you have an internal application that is only used inside of the company, then it might not have to be so highly available, but perhaps there is very confidential data, personal data of employees or users, financial data. And by thinking about the actual goals and the information security objects, we want to encourage developers to also think about how the application will be used, what data will be in the app, and also to prioritize their goals later on. When we do workshops like that, it's mostly very different levels of Flugebene, we say in Germany. So for availability, it might be very service or infrastructure based. So you would say that this web service or this API must be available. When talking about confidentiality, it's mostly about the type of data. So we want to make sure that personal data is secure, and then we can also write down that what services are affected by this personal data. Which database is it in? Which web service is processing the data? Is it shared with any third parties, for example? So that can all be written down, should be prioritized in some way. And this will also then help in understanding the threats, because not all threats or risks are relevant to all types of information security aspects. Talking about threats and risks, so there are different approaches to categorize or to define and think about risk. What we mostly use is the STRIDE mnemonic that's I think been published by Microsoft and has been around for some time, and that gives us 6 categories of attacks or of threats in which we can categorize our threats. So having a structure to think with or to work with, in my opinion, helps to think about most of the things. So if you were to do a threat modeling without any type of structure, you can use STRIDE, you can use PASTA, whatever, you might miss some things. And that's also one part where we developed the card game. just showing this stride diagram to developers could lead to some missing threads that are relevant. So I think I read an article where someone compared it to telling developers to think like a hacker is like telling a home cook to think like a professional chef. I mean, you know the basics, you know maybe some attacks against the availability of your application that would be categorized as a denial of service, but maybe you haven't heard of repudiation before. And if you don't know the threats that exist, it's hard to think of all the things on your own. So we like to have this kind of baseline and this kind of structure and mnemonic to think about stuff. But of course, you don't have to use Stride if you want to do your application threat modeling with kill chains or attack trees or pasta. That is also fine. But for us, Stride works pretty well because it's easy to understand, and I think it has all the relevant points. Most of the time when doing this threat modeling, we talk about all the threats and risks, and then we think about what can we do to prevent our application from being targeted in such a way. And that are the countermeasures that are the most important things to take home from such a workshop. How to document them is also basically up to the developers. One example that we like to use are evil user stories. So if you know Scrum, you know user stories, defining what the application should do for a specific user or use case. And we can also think about attacks and threats in that way. So for example, as an evil user, I want to steal session cookies, or I want to read session cookies in order to steal some financial information. That would be an attack from the outside, from a criminal hacker. And when you write down the application, when you write down the threat like that, you can then find out what to do against it. So you can use this as like an evil user story as a non-requirement. It should not work like that. But of course, as I also said, not all threats and risks come from external hackers or external actors in the end. It could also be internal users, like a lazy user that wants to use a very simple password because they don't want to remember it. It's not an attack in any case, but it's a problem that you can fix on a technical level through password complexity requirements, for example. And these 4 categories can be used as an inspiration how to document the threats and countermeasures. When doing such a workshop, of course, you should write down everything while you play the game and while you do the workshop, because you forget things in the end, and then you would have wasted some valuable resources and times. Do it as concrete as possible. So that's also one suggestion from our side. Just having a requirement like make the application secure is okay, but if you can restrict it even more, like saying I want to make session cookies very secure through cryptography or using JWTs and using IP-based checks if session cookies are used from different users, for example, writing that down as concretely as possible would be better. But that's like the general approach to threat modeling, and you can do that in any way you like. But it's also possible to do it with gamification or using serious games, and that's also one idea that we took from like previous research or previous work that I would say has been there before our time and before our card game was developed. One example that you might already know is the Elevation of Privilege game that was developed by Adam Shostak at Microsoft. It also follows the Stride mnemonic. Sorry, that's a difficult word. And is used to threat model web applications and local applications. So we also looked at that one and thought if we can use it in our projects and our threat modeling workshops. But we found out that there are very different levels of attacks. So some are very concrete and relevant to certain types of .NET development, for example. Others are very general and could be used for all types of applications. And it's also in English. Most of our clients were in Germany, so we wanted to look at something that that might be easier to understand when talking about threats. I think by now we could also translate the game that we developed, but yeah, so we looked at elevation of privilege and thought, yeah, it's not perfect for us. Is there something else? And of course, there is a different card game that is being developed by the OWASP project. It's also in English, and it's structured in a different way. So it's not using Stride. It's using some OWASP-related practices and has also 6 categories. And that's like an example of different methods using the same idea and serving the same purpose. So these 6 categories should also be used to structure all the threads and think about all the problems that the application could have. For example, data validation and encoding would in the Stride category would be able to fall into different categories. The OWASP card game is very focused on e-commerce shop websites, and that's not everything that we do. So we don't only threat model e-commerce web applications, we also do other types of applications. So it also wasn't perfect. But what I liked at that game was that it was very concrete. So with the cards, you can actually cover most of the general threats, and like OWASP top 10 style, it just shows a baseline. And what I also liked is that they reference open source intelligence like CAPEC, where if you know CAPEC is the I forgot the acronym. Well, it shows attackers ways to how they would attack web applications or applications in general, and it shows the strategies and tools or attack trees that you could use. And so from the card games, if you say, yeah, that's a threat that we might have, you can then look at more information, take a look at the CAPEC data and CAPEC numbers, the OWASP security guidelines, for example, this secure coding practices, SCP numbers in the first one would then show you countermeasures against the threat that that you have on the card. It was also in English, and that's another problem that we had.
CAPEC, you meant, is it a common attack pattern, enumeration, and classification?
Yes, yes,
right.
Thank you. That was it.
CAPEC, CAPC, right?
Yeah, CAPC. That's here. That is linked to CWEs, so common weakness, and those are then linked to CVEs, like the CVEs we all know from published vulnerabilities, and yeah, that's all linked. Very interesting to look at. So, but there are also many other security-related games, and Adam Shostak has a list on his website where, yeah, no, it opens, where you can find like games for incident response. There was a OWASP talk from the Munich chapter some time ago about a card game, Backdoors and Breaches it was called, where you basically can do incident response training and tabletop exercises using such a game. There is a whole role-playing game, like a pen and paper, such as Dungeons and Dragons, for example, with security relevant topics. I think we can share the link in the end. It doesn't seem to load right now. But using series games in the security context is not a new idea, and I think it's very interesting because only talking about security like once is not as good as having the security mindset where you think about security all the time and think about the threats in like everyday life. And getting people to think about security is very hard. So if you're not trained to do it, you need some inspiration, and using games for that is, in my opinion, a great idea because it engages everyone. You get the people to participate, you get them to think about and talk about security, and that also has a training effect. So after playing such a card game a few times, you have a much improved knowledge about security and can use it later on. That's also why we created our own game. As I said, there were some before us, but they weren't perfect for our use cases. And also the design could have been better. So I designed and hand-drawn a couple of cards. There's one example. So all the cards are based on the Stride categories. Each card is linked to one Stride category on the top, for example, information disclosure. And the actual attack in this category would be reading the cache as the attack title. And in the description, we have written down one example how the attacker would use the attack as a user story or evil user story. So as an attacker, I want to view cache data in that has been cached by search engines, for example, by Google, to read sensitive information. So the threat is someone misconfigured the robots.txt, for example, or publishes sensitive information in a public folder. And this information is then being crawled by search engines, and any attacker, anyone could find sensitive information just by Googling, for example, the website. We have seen that in the past in real cases in pen tests. It's based on real life experience, and when you read the card, you might also see that there is a score in the top left. It's based on the CVSS score, so we want to think about how dangerous this attack could be, how high of a severity it would have if it had a real CVSS score. So then you can also compare cards, and we're going to use that when playing the game. As I said, there are 6 types of cards, basically, the 6 categories of Stride. So we have spoofing, for example, forging of certificates, that an attacker could forge a certificate to impersonate a server against the users to get sensitive information. Tampering with data, defacement attacks by changing HTML content on a public website, or repudiation, like manipulating the logging or not being able to say who has done an attack, for example, by using vulnerability scans from the public internet to find security vulnerabilities. And if you don't realize that you are being scanned, you might also not realize that you have some vulnerabilities that can be found. The other 3 categories: information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. There is one card that is not part of these Stride categories, that is the Joker, and that is like the unknown 0-day that has the highest CVSS of 10. You can't really find any concrete countermeasures against a 0-day. So that is one way to also think about new kinds of attacks and what to do if there are vulnerabilities in the application. So when you think about the assume breach context, you could be hacked at any time. How would you realize if you've been hacked? What would you do to perform incident response, business continuity measures, etc.? For each category, we have a couple of cards, and that is, I think, also one of the critique points, potential improvements for the card game. If you were to play the same game, the same set of cards for the next 5 years, you would probably miss some new threats. So it's not a fixed security set, and I think that will never be possible because the attackers improve their methods. There are new requirements. So you should always think about, is this set of cards still relevant for today's threats? But right now, I think it covers the most important things. Yeah, that's a bit of background on the CVSS score. So it was calculated using the baseline calculation. So the exploitability, what is the actual, it should be impact on the top, of course, sorry, impact and exploitability on the bottom. How to play the game? I think it's difficult to read, but when you play it, it's pretty obvious. You have a couple of people playing the game, like 4 to 6 people would be pretty good. Then you can talk a lot, and everyone can participate. Everyone gets the same number of cards. They are being shuffled and then being handed out. And you start at one person, and everyone lays a card like in a clockwise circle, for example. You play a card, and then you describe the attack. And for example, I could play one card with a CVSS score of 7, and then you all have to tell me why this attack wouldn't work, what countermeasures you have already implemented, and what countermeasures you would implement to fend off the attack. If you cannot safely defend the threat or the risk, which is most of the time, the card remains on the table, and the next person can try to outplay me by playing a card of the same category with a higher score, and also describing the attack. And yeah, so as a player, I want to play as many high cards as I can to collect them in the end. That's the gamification part. So you want to play the best threats, you want to have the best attacks, and everyone else tries to remediate your attack, tell you why it won't work or why it shouldn't work, what you would do to, what security measures you would implement in order to work against this attack. You should also set a time limit. We have found out that it can take a few minutes per card to discuss all the countermeasures, especially if it's a real application and you have a real development team. They can get pretty emotional, and you should then maybe set a time limit per card, for example. The winner is who has scored the most points. So it's also very obvious, like any other card playing game. Any questions so far? Is there anyone from Discord who had a question?
I'm not seeing anything in Discord. Also not on YouTube.
Okay. Then I think we can play a couple of cards. And to do that, we have a sample application that we want to threat model. I hope you are not affected, but the idea is that there is a Corona test center web application where you can book test appointments, go to some testing place, get the test done by test staff, and receive your test result via email. So we have different types of users. So we have admins who own the application and who can create new test centers. We have test staff who work with the application, enter the personal data, enter the test result, and us as patients who don't have an actual account, but we just have this website to book a test appointment and receive the results via email. We could also think that this application might report the positive test results to some health department organizations, for example. So we have very sensitive information, health data that is, of course, very worthy of protection. And since the application is available from the public internet, we probably also have a lot of attacks that could be done against it. What are the most important assets? That's, as I said, always the first step, understanding the priorities. And I think that's pretty obvious. So we have health data, we have personal data, we have some credentials and access data for the test center users. For the integrity, we wouldn't want test results to be changed. We want the personal data and the master data to be not changed. And also when we report some things or when we send data over the internet, we also want that to be protected. For the availability, I think the most important thing that should work is the retrieval and sending of test results. So if you go to a test station, you want to receive your test result because that's why you went there. We need to make sure that the test operators, the test staff can perform the test and enter the data into the database. And we want to be able to book appointments. And that is the basic priority. We could think even more about what type of database is the most relevant for the availability, for example. But in that stage of the development, we don't have that kind of data yet. So we just have the idea of this test center web application. And so we have to work with the information that we have. We have already thought about some infrastructure components. So the web application will be hosted at some public cloud provider. Doesn't matter which one. They all provide a database as a service. So there is some Postgres SQL database. We have some file storage where we want to store blob data binaries. For example, PDF test results that have been generated are stored in this file storage. There could be a Java backend web server, some firewall, an external email provider, and then we have the end users, the test centers, and us as patients, of course. For the sake of playing the game, I have written down some ideas about how it could be implemented. The web application has like an Nginx web server. It's written React in Java, and some thoughts about the users. So there are shared accounts for the test centers. That is, of course, a security problem, but could be a real-life case. And for the patients, receiving the test result is done via encrypted PDF. And the PDF is encrypted with the date of birth, which is also not that secret, but better than nothing. Yeah, and of course, everything is accessible from the outside internet. So at least the firewall and web server. What would we do then when we play this game in workshops? We would hand out cards, and everyone would receive like 4 to 5 cards and look at them and then decide what card to play first. In order to simulate that, I mean, I could show you the cards right here. We have printed out the card deck. It comes in a nice cardboard box. So we hand those out to clients, and there are all the different types of, I hope you can see it. It's very difficult to see, so that's why we want to play it with the digital files. But to show you that it actually works pretty well, I am going to shuffle the cards, and I will be joined by Armin and yep, Matthias.
Here I am.
Yes.
You also want to play the game. So right now do you have any questions about the application? I mean, you played the game already. You know how it works. Matthias, do you think?
No questions, but it sounds actually like a real use case. I mean, I know from my family or my parents that they received the result, and the PDF they got was actually, and the password was the date of birth, right? So it sounds like taken from the real world, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, it's based on my experience as well.
Yeah.
We also had the idea of using some open source application that we could thread model and then bring the results back to the community, but we didn't find a easy enough application. So
not the juice shop, right?
Not the juice shop. Right. Actually, the German Corona Warn app has the thread modeling in their GitHub repository. So we could look at how they did it, but they didn't have our card game. So I think it could be improved. So, okay, I have shuffled, and I'm just going to start by playing the first card that I have received, and I can share the card on my screen as well. It would be this one. Let's hope, can we see it like that? Let me go to a new slide. You can't really see it that well. Okay, 1 second. I'll just have to open it in a different application. Okay, so the first card, I can already explain it, is of the category information disclosure. and I want to sniff the communication. So as an attacker, I have one leg in an internal network through some way, for example, through a vulnerability in the firewall or in the web server. I have the ability to sniff on the internal network, which was a very basic, not segmented network in this case, so inside of this cloud environment. And I can now read all unencrypted data that is being sent between the different services. I think that is a very real threat. Not all companies, not all projects encrypt traffic internally, so there is no zero trust approach in that case. And that is basically my attack. It's of a 5.8 CVSS, so it's not that high because you already have to be inside of the network. But now you guys would be up to find some ways to prevent this attack and prevent me from getting 5.8 points by finding some measures, countermeasures. What would you do to prevent this attack?
So what we have available, like add some encryption and authorization between the different services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I have the card, right?
Yeah, there are no countermeasure cards, so we would write that down.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also recommend that we write down that we want to encrypt everything and encrypt our internal communication as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think you have a valid card.
Yeah, we got the comment here. Encryption,
Encryption
authentication, authorization. Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So encrypt internal traffic, role-based authentication. Yeah.
Yep.
Would also work. Cool. But we can say that right now in the current stage, this card would probably work. So it can stay on the table. And the next one, one of you, I think we will just start at the top. That would be Matthias. You can then play a card. And I will try to find, okay, nice. The next card that you can play to trump my card, to beat me at my own game, would also be an information disclosure card. It has to be of the same category. I have it right here, and let's pull it up on the screen.
Okay.
I can pull it up on the screen.
Right.
Would be this card. Let me just...
All right.
Close all this stuff. Okay. And now you would present the card to us, because in the beginning we don't know what you are playing.
Right. So it's a user enumeration, right? So
Yep.
I loop through add some parameters in my queries, right? That's randomly from, I don't know, 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 1,000,000, and I try to fetch whatever is there.
Yep. I think in this application case, it's more difficult because we don't have that many user accounts, but we could, that's also the goal of the game. If the card doesn't fit perfectly to the use case we have here, we can manipulate the attack. And one example of this case would be maybe we can enumerate not the users, but test results. So maybe all the test result PDF files are generated with a naming scheme that is just increasing numbers for each test result. And if you can find out where they are stored, maybe you can just enumerate everything. And yeah, we have some measures against it already in the chat. IAM policy,
Right.
so identity management and access control. That is, of course, one measure that we could use against it. Against user enumeration in the classical sense, we could also do like rate limiting, IP-based rate limiting, for example. We could randomize IDs so that they are not easy to guess, using hashed values, for example. masking data, not providing the ID in the first place could be an idea. But then I would also think that this card could work, and we would write down all the countermeasures. So I'm not going to write down everything because it would take a lot of time. But then we would continue beating this card, like the first card, until no one can or wants to beat it by not having a higher CVSS score. I would say, for the sake of this demo, we can say that Matthias, you beat my card. You can perform the attack, and Armin in this case doesn't have an information disclosure card that he can play. So you would receive both cards for your score. So your score is 6.5 plus 5.8, and you would get the cards. And then we would continue playing in the same way. And the next card, I already have it here, is a elevation of privilege card. And that one looks like this. 1 second. Here we go. And Armin, that could be your card.
Okay.
As soon as you see it.
So we have the elevation of privilege. I want to steal some session tokens as an attacker. I have want to get access to the application by getting some access tokens. And I think that could be a valid attack on the test center staff or on the admins, because they probably have like sessions. I think the patients, they don't really have it because they just access like their test results maybe. But if I'm able to get the session tokens of the test stations, and for example, if we use JWT tokens and they are not correctly implemented, I could try to get any JWT and just, if it's not signed correctly, just elevate my privileges. That's something we see quite often.
Yeah, true. And that would be very interesting for an attacker. So getting the access of someone at the test station, then you could create fake test results, for example. You could just generate negative tests for you and your friends and not care about the actual testing. But what would we do against stealing session tokens? So signing tokens could be one idea, but even then you can steal them. Not keeping them for too long, for example, so making them invalid after a couple of times. Invalidate tokens. Maybe also check if the same token is used from different IP addresses in a short time range. Could we do
storing the tokens properly? I mean, where you store it? What is it? The cookie is local storage, right? Make it. I mean, depending how the website is.
Yeah, depending on how you got the cookie or the session token, it could also be an idea to think about content security policies, what JavaScript can be executed. If you physically go to the test center and physically steal the token, then it's of course harder to defend against. But for online attacks from the public internet, I think those are some basic things you can do against it.
And don't send the token the URL.
Very good idea. Yeah, that's like an inside joke. Okay, let me find the next elevation of privilege card to see if we can beat it. Okay, yeah, I have found one. I'm then going to play a even higher elevation of privilege card. Different kinds of tokens for different tasks.
Maybe it's about maybe the different types of tokens or different scopes in the tokens, right? It's also about this, I guess, authorization.
Yeah.
Based on scopes, right?
Absolutely. Role-based authentication in the end is also a good idea. Okay. So my attack is unsafe deserialization of data. So I want to manipulate serialized data in requests to execute malicious code or to get faked access rights in the application. So basically, data manipulation. There are very similar cards in this case. So when you think about XSS or any kind of injection attack, we have different ways to leverage the injection attacks. So because, for example, there are persistent XSS, there is like how do you get the code into the application? Is it executed for every user? Is it executed in the database when you do some late night reporting tools, for example? But in this case, it's unsafe deserialization. So not even like a basic injection attack. But what could you do against these kinds of attacks?
First of all, input validation, right? And then also making sure that all the processes, let's say once you're in, make sure that all the processes run with the proper user, not the root user, right? I mean, if you're already in, you want to make sure that you can't execute or access everything. Yeah.
Absolutely. Which could be a problem in containerized applications in this public cloud infrastructure when you don't restrict the container access rights, for example. Yeah. All right. Let's maybe take a look at a couple of different cards then. What are some interesting things? Okay. I'll just select a few cards now and display them. One that I really like is a denial of service attack. So as an attacker, I want to misuse CPU intensive features of the application to create a denial of service in the web server. And I could, for example, do that. Generating the PDF could take a long time if I input a very, very long name as my in the form field. So I use a really long string, and the PDF is then, I don't know, 1,000 pages long because my name is so long, and that's going to take a lot of time. And in that time, no one can receive test results because no new test results are produced.
Right.
So measures against that, I think, like restricting what you can upload, for example.
Yeah. There's also this famous example where you have a small kilobyte size zip file. If you extract it, it turns into a petabyte, right? So this is also very popular. You see it in every course, right? So yeah, input validation, right?
Same thing, yeah. Input validation. Only being able to upload. Oh yeah, that one is also true, of course. Reduce remove interfaces.
Yep. We have one more. Use firewall, a WAF, right? Limiting the request, ban the IP if necessary, resource limitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe also when thinking about how to program the application, building in some timeouts. So if you are calculating for more than a defined time, then you just throw an error and tell the user that there was a problem, not hogging resources for a long time. So freeing up resources, error handling. Could have then of course be a problem if there is an error on the application and all the requests time out, but that's a different threat, different case. Okay.
Bring the Joker.
Bring the Joker. Okay.
No, just kidding.
we can do it as the last attack. Then we can all go home. Okay. Yeah, that is a pretty common attack, a pretty common threat, I would say. Also, information disclosure, async data processing. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Would someone of you want to present the card?
Application information. So as an attacker, I want to use HTTP headers, source code, or file names to understand the underlying libraries or frameworks that are being used. So then I can, go into the vulnerability database to look for these, vulnerabilities in these specific libraries under these specific versions. So typical reconnaissance here. Yeah.
Typical reconnaissance, yes. Sending any type of version number, or not sending any type of version number for the application would be a countermeasure. Updating everything. So that is, of course, a very basic measurement.
I want to say my Joker is we use log4j for logging.
That's a problem. Yeah. Yeah, but
custom error handling we have here.
Custom error handling.
Yeah, that's always these arrow pages where you often see the version numbers and get too much details about the application.
Disabling any debugging features. Absolutely. And yeah, then we would continue playing until the time limit is reached. And as it is almost 3 minutes before 1 o'clock, I would say we have reached our time limit. We didn't really count the cards that time, but someone will then have won. And the result of our workshop would be that we have Jira tickets or any kind of backlog of all the security measurements that we have identified. And when we have implemented everything, or when we have decided how to handle it, we have hopefully made our application more secure. And then we can start again. So after a couple of weeks, when we want to program a new feature, when there is some significant change in the application, we would repeat it. And since there are, I think, more than enough cards for 1 hour of playing, we can still play the same cards again. Think about new ways how to attack our application with the same types of attacks and categories. But of course, after some time, I think it gets boring, and that would be the time when the organization is at a point that they don't want to use the card game anymore, that they have matured so much that they can think about using their own methods, extending the card game. Maybe we will release a version 2 at some point. But of course, you shouldn't use the same cards for all eternity, because they might get outdated. And especially when we think about authentication, things are going to change. So yeah, that's basically the idea of our card game. And that's what we play with our clients. We also provide it to anyone who is interested in application threat modeling. Since it's in Germany, it's mostly German-based requests, of course, that we get. But yeah, that's the idea. Thank you very much for taking your time. I hope you had a nice lunch. And now, of course, I'm also open to any discussion, any questions about that.
Yes, thanks, Maxi, for this presentation. It's I like gamification, right? So it's great to see. I have a few other examples also. Like last DevSec meetup, we had somebody in the OT field, operational security, right? And there's also this on Steam. If you play games, right, on Steam, there's also this what's it called? threat gen, red team versus blue team, where you simulate like these industrial attacks.
Yeah.
My question would be like, oh, we got one question here. How can we order 3 packs?
Send me an email.
Just send an email. Great. How do you? So the idea is clear, right? How and you as a with your company, you're doing obviously like security. Yeah, maybe can you explain what you do? Like, is it for educational purposes? Is it really to? I mean, is it more like educational purposes in general to, let's say, educate developer teams, or is it really like a customer comes to you and says, okay, I really want to build this real application and we want to use this as a way to do threat modeling?
I think it's both. So we have clients where we have like a long-standing relationship and where we are integrated in the development process. And at some point, we just told them that we have this card game. Do you want to play it? But we also have projects that are specific for application security and threat modeling. So someone comes to us and says, hey, I have an idea about the application, or I already have an application and now I want to improve the security. And then we have this selection of penetration testing and doing workshops, training the developers. And the game is like get people to brainstorm and get them to think about security. So it's not a single solution that we use, but it's part of the whole secure coding process.
Yeah, I think it's very nice. It kind of triggers your creativity, right? It's not like a dry checklist. Okay, have we done this and this and this? It's more like interactive, and also, as we see in the comment, right? It's a brainstorming session, really, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
All right, let me see if I have anything else in Discord, but I don't think so. No more questions. No, so we don't have any more questions, but if anybody has some questions or watches the video later on, just drop some comments there and they can reach out to you on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever, right?
Yes, absolutely. Feel free to send us an email, find me on LinkedIn.
So in this, thank you very much for your talk. Also, Armin, for joining. I think it's a very, very good session, very interactive. We had a lot of comments actually. And thank you for your talk. I want to just announce one thing for the upcoming sessions. So in June, we might not have a speaker for the Germany meetup chapter. This would be probably in July again, because in June we have the DevSecCon 24 conference. It's a global conference including all the chapters away, and this will be mid-June, right? So this is why we skip the German chapter this upcoming month. So everybody who joins today, feel free to join us on Discord. Also, of course, you guys, feel free to join us on Discord. Keep in touch, and that's it from my side. I wish you all a very good rest of the day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Maxi. Thanks, Armin.
See you.
Thanks.